New videos every day.
All right, I'm John Breeding. It's Monday, September 12th, 2011, about 103 degrees here in Austin, Texas. And I want to do a video here on the subject of guilt and shame. These are two emotions that are primary drivers of a lot of human behavior. And I had a particular incident that reminded me of a story that I've heard. It's a rabbi story about a guy whose footprint is 6 feet long. He falls on his face. He's 6 feet tall. He falls on his face, gets back up, takes a step, falls on his face, gets back up, humbling along. That life is like that, you know. We're constantly humbled by our mistakes and shortcomings. And I came back from taking my stepson to start his new college career up in Western Massachusetts and got in trouble. And I got chastised by my dean, and I was wrong. And I deserved this chastisement. And I felt like a little boy back in school or something, you know. It's very re-stimulating. That's what tends to happen with these kind of emotions that are left over from experiences of probably being humbled or intimidated by authority as a child. And so even though I'm 59 years old, you know, it kind of got me. So I wanted to talk about that, you know, this subject of guilt and shame. They're not exactly the same things, but they tend to go together, and oftentimes we think of them as the same. And for many practical purposes they are. But guilt technically refers more to the feeling that comes with a specific behavior, and shame more to the feeling that goes with a sense of self as a bad actor. You know, so the action versus the self. Guilt is a feeling that I did something wrong. Shame is a feeling that I am something wrong. So it's a deeper and more abiding kind of feeling that I'm a bad person. Guilt is a signal, at least initially, that something's out of line. Shame is a feeling that creates an attitude called it's unbearable to be exposed, and so you stay hidden and don't want to be seen. That's one way to identify shame. And they're kind of tricky feelings because they have a lot of activity that gets triggered around them, meaning we defend ourselves against these feelings because they're awful. And so when there's shame and guilt going on, a lot of times there's these attitudes that come into play basically to defend ourselves against these feelings because they feel so bad. Like anger, like avoidance. So we avoid situations or people that are going to bring up those feelings. Or we go into attack mode and blame somebody else rather than really feeling and taking responsibility for our own feelings. A lot of times in response to shame, we can also take on a kind of a pseudo self-esteem, and meaning that I'm arrogant and I'm great and you're not, right? As opposed to just a relaxed confidence inside of ourselves. So we see all these faces that are really defenses against shame or against guilt. And so when these things come up, it's really tricky and difficult to actually face it and take responsibility head on because we want to avoid it or blame somebody else. I thought of another thing with this too is a function of apologies. You know, they have many, many functions, you know. And so they can mean a lot of different things. Just like when you say, I love you, say, I love you, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For one person, it means, oh, that's so sweet. And for another person, it's like, what do you want? You know, when somebody says, I love you. Now, apologies can mean a lot of different things too. You know, they can be sincere, of course, a sincere expression of regret. But a lot of times they can be a dynamic, for example, basically avoiding punishment and rejection. So you apologize to avoid getting hurt worse when you don't necessarily really mean it. Or to avoid responsibility. So you just apologize and it's like somehow that means I'm not guilty or responsible. Or sometimes it can be a defeat. Like, you know people who just apologize for everything. You know, they just seem like they're defeated in life. They apologize before they even have reason to apologize. Or that can also just be an ongoing face of shame. It's kind of the flip side of the person who's so arrogant and full of themselves that they never apologize because they're never wrong, versus the person who's always apologizing because they just feel wrong all the time. So you see all kinds of distortions here. But I felt really bad because I was responsible. I didn't go into attack. I certainly felt like avoiding, like, I'll just quit that job and I don't want to ever be in a school situation again, or get angry. But I was mostly frustrated with myself in this particular situation. Seems like even at age 59, I get re-stimulated with these things occasionally, and it just takes me a few days to kind of shake it off. Today I was working on it and kind of discharging, and what I figured out and discovered was that it seems like that fear is always wound in there with guilt and shame. And so I know when I work on it, I end up getting to this underlying fear that's really going on. Once I free that up, it tends to free it up. Seems like shame always has fear with it. I don't think the other is necessarily true. I think you can feel fear that's just a pure fear without the shame. But with shame, it seems like there's always fear. And fear and shame are kind of the key aspects of emotional recovery. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the way out of guilt and shame. One way to think about guilt is that it's a conflict between image and action. So it's really an ethics dynamic. You've got an image of who you ought to be as a good person, and you violate that image, and this guilt is the signal that something's offline ethically, right? So the way out is that you either change the image or the action. You either realize that that image is off, and that, for example, maybe it is really okay to have sex before marriage, and I don't need to feel guilty about that sex is a beautiful thing, so I'll change that image and free it up, possibly, right? Or I change the action and say, I do need to talk to my dean in these situations and not do my sort of Lone Ranger thing, and so I just change the action and don't do that in the future, right? Change the image or change the action. It's an ethics thing. And there's all kinds of faces of that, I was raised Catholic, and in that tradition, it was called confession. A lot of people in addiction recovery, 12-step programs, that kind of thing, they do the steps. They do a 4th step and, in effect, confess their actions. There's many ways to deal with sort of rehabilitating ethics, right? And a secular way of doing it, too, is in counseling, And that's not only for guilt, but big time for shame, because remember, with shame, the feeling is that it's unbearable to be exposed. And so, as with so many things in life and personal growth and transformation, the way out involves doing the very thing that you least feel like doing. You don't want to expose, and yet to recover and heal the shame that binds you, to use the title of John Bradshaw's book. It's a really good resource. It's called Healing the Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. You have to do the very thing you don't want to do, which calls you have to expose. You have to expose that which you are most ashamed of. The metaphor is like a beach ball underwater. You're holding it, and it's all this energy. That's like a secret. And you let it go and you release all that energy. It frees up all that emotional energy. So you have to tell your story. The trick is to tell it to someone who's not going to blast you for it and shame you worse. So you have to find people that are safe and trustworthy in that kind of dynamic. So exposing. As I said, these things can trigger a lot of fear, and so you see a lot of faces of psychiatric diagnoses like anxiety and depression that are going on, and really, they can be handled by freeing up these ethical violations, or just freeing up this history of having been shamed and humiliated and finding a safe place. Because the antidote to shame ultimately is complete self-acceptance. Complete self-acceptance. And so I want to mention another resource besides just saying, I made a mistake, and exposing it and getting people to love and support you in that place. Another great resource is from a guy named Dan Jones that was a counselor of mine at one time. He has a website you can find called howtolivehappily.net. Howtolivehappily.net. It's a really great and informative resource. But on that is a poem called Shameless. You can also find it in my Wildest Colts Make the Best Horses book. But check out howtolivehappily.net, the poem Shameless by Dan Jones. It's a modern day version of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And I'm just going to read you the first couple of paragraphs because it gives you an idea about one direction that you can play with to move towards complete self-acceptance. And I'll end with this. Elders are shocked. Preachers fall out of their pulpits. Mothers stop their children's ears. But it's true, and I'll say it. I am head over heels in love with myself. Starry-eyed crazy about me, my own self. Pouring rapturous praises over myself. I crown myself with laurels, pin on rows of medals, grin and strut and crow until shame itself is scandalized. That's it.
Please subscribe to our channel, and you should also visit our new website. Because we have over 1,300 videos on our channel, I know it can be a little difficult to navigate and find the videos that you want to see. But if you visit us at Psychetruth.net, you'll be able to find the videos you want to see and watch them there. So we encourage you to go to Psychetruth next time you want to search for something, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.